John, thank you for joining me for the podcast. It's good to discuss because you've been smeared as a traitor to Palestinians and a race traitor. Every single term of abuse has been hurled at you under the sun. You have a really interesting perspective as somebody who is Palestinian, who is nevertheless very critical of Hamas and critical of the tactics used by militant groups in order to, in their view, liberate Palestine. I think we're both similar in that we both are very critical of the Israeli government, and yet really at the end of the day we support a two-state solution, which I think is really quite a moderate and mainstream proposition. And yet if you went onto Twitter, you would absolutely not, you wouldn't realize that that is like a mainstream proposition. People all over Twitter are getting into all sorts of extreme conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism. It's just completely blanketed with propaganda, and even pro-Hamas propaganda all over Twitter. So, I mean, John, maybe you can discuss, maybe just to start off, you can explain to just your history, your background as somebody with a Palestinian father who was born in the West Bank, who was born and lived under occupation, and we can go from there. I think it's a really interesting story, and as I said, I really appreciate the fact that we're able to talk now. I mean, I've really admired your voice of reason over the past few weeks. The fact that you have been very critical of the Israeli government while also sticking to a humanist position, and that is very rare, unfortunately, online.
Well, hi, Drew. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I am a Palestinian-British man. My father was born in the West Bank. He grew up with military occupation. His family had to hide in caves during the 6-Day War. So, we've been severely touched by the conflict. He moved to the United States and Britain, after he grew up. He was studying physics. He was a physicist. So he gave me a very strong sense of that I should be proud to be Palestinian. I should be a Palestinian. I should participate in Palestinian culture. And, I strongly stand by that. I'm a proud Palestinian. I love Palestine. I want Palestine to become an independent country. And by Palestine, I mean a Palestinian state with some borders negotiated between Palestine and Israel. So you do have the peaceful coexistence, a tolerant coexistence between, the Zionist state of Israel and a Palestinian state. And, I, throughout my life, I've sort of become a little bit involved in peace movements at a low level. I started off with things like clubhouse rooms and Facebook groups and advocating a little bit on Twitter. My presence blew up on Twitter after the October 7th attack because, of course, I was condemning the barbaric attack by Hamas. I stand very strongly against terrorism and against, any mistreatment of a civilian population, whether that's the Palestinians, whether that's the Israelis, whether that's Ukrainians, right? So I think people wanted to hear the perspective of someone who is Palestinian and is looking for peace and is looking to kind of create a situation where Palestinians and Israelis can live together peacefully. And I think that, I receive a lot of abuse. So do you. I also receive a lot of positive messages.
Yes, yeah.
And people saying they're very, very, people from both an Israeli background and a Palestinian background saying that they're very glad that people are speaking up in favor of peace, because I think in the long term, peaceful coexistence is the only realistic option. I don't think the status quo is sustainable. People in Gaza don't want to live like this.
Of course.
People in Israel, they don't want to be kidnapped and have rocket attacks. They don't want to live like this either, right? So it's nightmarish. It's nightmarish on both sides.
Yes, of course. I mean, just the constant insecurity of Palestinian civilians and Israeli civilians, and I think it's exactly as you say. I mean, there's insecurity on both sides. There's been, throughout history over the past few decades, there have been horrendous massacres. There have been horrendous atrocities carried out against civilians on both sides of the population, and we have seen, basically decades and decades of revenge killings and revenge-based violence, and clearly it's just not sustainable. And there is right now a absolutely gargantuan humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Absolutely.
And there are still rockets being launched as well into Israel. I mean, just
Absolutely.
today, I saw one of your posts. There was actually a Hamas rocket that hit a Palestinian hospital in Ramallah, I believe it was.
Yeah, I mean, how they want to free Palestine by firing rockets at Ramallah. You know, that's it's crazy.
They're hitting Palestinian hospitals. You know, it's shocking, and just the amount of suffering that we've seen from October 7 onwards. And of course, this is what people argue, that you can't just take the entire history as starting on October 7. Of course, it actually goes back more than a century now. And of course, there has been constant insecurity for the Palestinians for decades, and I absolutely acknowledge that. And exactly as you say, I want to see an independent Palestinian state established alongside an existing Israeli state, so that both peoples can have the right to self-determination and to live peacefully coexist together.
Exactly.
Maybe you can just explain a bit more, like, about, you know, what types of things your father experienced growing up under occupation, and how that informed his political views, and what his outlook was, and how he talked about the conflict to you as you grew up.
Right. So I'll give you two examples. The first one I talked about in my Atlantic article, where he was going through a checkpoint, and he was a physics student. He was carrying an astrophysics textbook, and the soldier, one of the soldiers, who I think self-identified as a Kahanist, so far right Jewish supremacist, told him, you know, Arabs are too stupid to study astrophysics. In the UK, some of us might dismiss that as banter, but I think to my father that was very hurtful. And
of course, especially going through a military checkpoint. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So that was very upsetting to him. So as I say, he lived his life under an Israeli military occupation, and that was extremely upsetting to him. And another example I could give, maybe more on the positive side, is that back then there wasn't a separation barrier, right? There wasn't what they call the apartheid wall, right? So it was much easier for Palestinians to get jobs in Israel. So my dad actually he worked on the roads in Israel. He was a road worker, doing asphalt. So he would work side by side with Israelis. And he could understand Hebrew, for example, which is amazing. My Arabic's pretty weak. My Hebrew's even weaker. So I definitely need to improve that about myself as a Palestinian. I do feel strongly about that. But he could understand Hebrew, and he had many Jewish and Israeli colleagues, and friends and acquaintances over his life. He worked as a ultimately his final role in life was working in Silicon Valley as a technology worker, right?
Wow, yeah.
So obviously he had lots and lots of Jewish and Israeli colleagues. So he, in many ways, my dad's history is a model for peaceful coexistence. He had in terms of his personal life, he had very peaceful views. I think in terms of his solution to the wider conflict, he had the view that it's all Palestine, and it's all eventually going to become a Palestinian state. And I personally, we respectfully disagreed with each other. This is not something I'm just rolling out now. This is conversations I had with my dad during his life. We disagreed about this. I thought it was perfectly realistic to say, okay, let's have a two-state solution, right? And Palestinians can have self-determination and civil rights, and the right to build up an economy and a country. And of course, on the other side, the Israelis can have their own self-determination. So that was his view. But he was a very peaceful person, and I respect my father a lot. I think he was a very good human, and someone who would have been able to live in peaceful coexistence with both sides.
Yeah, of course. And just on that note about a potential one-state solution, I mean, obviously I favor a two-state solution. I don't think a one-state solution, I don't believe that such a solution, or a one-state solution, is by itself necessarily, like anti-Semitic or something like that. Because, for example, I've begun reading Edward Said, and he advocated a one-state solution, but he was very clear in condemning Hamas and condemning terror attacks. And his vision of a one-state solution was the two peoples living side by side in peace. And so, where that is the argument, of course, I can understand it, even though I respectfully disagree, and I do favor a two-state solution. It's more when it comes down to the Hamas supporters who very openly talk about purging people, and they say on Twitter, and there are thousands of posts like this getting thousands upon thousands of likes, saying all the Israelis can go back to Brooklyn or go back to Poland, which is obviously just very callous and anti-Semitic. And I mean, it also just even ignores the fact that half of the Israeli population is descended from Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East, who were expelled from countries across the Middle East and North Africa. They don't actually have another homeland to go to. They've already been expelled. And so, I mean, that's for me why I'm so uncomfortable when I see people just talk about just abolishing Israel as a state and not providing any security guarantees whatsoever for Israelis. When you've got a group like Hamas, which does very openly, I mean, its original charter was talking about, the protocols of the elders of Zion, and the original charter did talk about basically purging Israelis. And then I watched a bit of your recent interview with infamous tanky Marxist-Leninist, who was basically saying, oh, well, they've updated their charter to 2017. Well, October 7 really, in my view, basically invalidates the idea that they've updated their charter, because what we saw on October 7 was I've seen footage of a Hamas fighter trying to behead a Thai migrant worker while screaming Yahud, Yahud, which is...
I've seen that too.
Which is the Arabic term for Jew. And so clearly they were just slaughtering anyone in their path that they believed to be Jewish. And it's unfortunate that it has become so viral and popular online to dismiss the atrocities of October 7. The first day or two, I still will always remember how there were so many people gloating and people saying, this is what decolonization
looks like.
And they justified it by saying, well, they're all settler colonists. And I will never forget Hassan Piker, one of the most popular sort of Gen Z streamers, saying, oh, well, babies can even be settler colonists. And this was the original narrative. And then I think as it became clear just how horrendous the violence was on October 7, I think people then had to, adjust the narrative to the point where they actually just denied it wholesale or claimed that the IDF actually killed everyone, because it became so clear that the atrocities were just so horrendous.
Yeah, so I mean, I personally, I look at this very much from the perspective of self-determination for both, because there are two national liberation movements here. There is Zionism, which is the national liberation movement for the Jewish people, and there's Palestinian Arab nationalism, which is the national liberation movement for Palestinian Arabs. And maybe extremists from both sides, whether it's the Hamas charter or the Likud charter, claim all of the land for one side, right? Whether that's Zionism, whether that's Palestinian Arab nationalism. But the reality is that neither side is going anywhere, right?
Yes.
Neither side is going to be removed from the land at the end of the day. The roots go very deep, and genetically both sides are indigenous to this land, right? Genetically, culturally. And
really the fantasies of mass ethnic expulsion, whether they come from Likud ministers and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, or whether they come from Hamas, I just view them as disgusting. And I can acknowledge that, there are major sections of the current Israeli coalition government that dream of the total ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And I hate that. And as you said, there are two populations that have deep-rooted attachment to this land, that have deep-rooted historic ties to the land. And whether it's a Likudnik who's saying, well, the Palestinians are a made-up people, and there's still people who try and claim that, and I think it's racist and wrong.
I see it every day, and I see Palestinians need to go to Jordan, right?
And I see that, yes.
Jordan is the two-state solution, but that isn't an answer either. You can't kick people out of their long-term homes. It's not realistic. It's not kind, and it's not humane. So that's how we get to a two-state solution. The idea of splitting the land and two states for two different national movements, where the extremists from both sides, the people on both sides who want to kill someone else, are kept separate.
Yes.
But
yes.
In terms of October the 7th and the initial narrative that you were talking about, the decolonization narrative, I think it's so dangerous.
It is,
to get into a situation where you are sanctioning violence against civilians. And you're saying that violence against civilians, against babies and against children, is justified. I think it's so dangerous to make that out, because remember, these people don't just want to stop with Israel; they want to dismantle the United States, right? They want to dismantle Australia, and of course, there have been terrible crimes committed against indigenous people in both the United States and in Australia, by the way. So I'm not denying that.
No, of course.
But it's so dangerous where you come up with this narrative of decolonization that is effectively going to rip society apart. The legitimate grievances of indigenous Australians and indigenous Americans and Palestinian people can be dealt with through a truth and reconciliation process, through negotiation, through airing out our legitimate grievances and talking about these things rationally and stating to people's faces, this is what was done to us. This is the pain that we're experiencing, right? And saying this is the help that we need in order to have, reasonable lives. And by promoting this decolonization narrative, they're actually postponing and making it harder to reach a reasonable, non-violent solution where we can all peacefully coexist together.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, very well expressed, and I really agree. It's sad how dangerous that whole narrative was, because there is, the idea of decolonization, throughout the centuries. Of course, I mean, occupied peoples do deserve a homeland, and so, the idea of decolonization is entirely legitimate. But sadly, people begun to, using the writings of Fanon, etc., they wanted to associate the idea of decolonization, which, as you said, can be done in a humane way, where, involving historical truth commissions, etc., truth telling, debate, discussion, rational discussion. They wanted to actually displant that in favor of just killing people based on their race. And some of the ideas behind that, I mean, the idea that somebody should be killed as a settler colonist if they don't have a legitimate blood tie to the land, I mean, that is literally the mindset and the worldview of the Nazis. This is my problem with it. I mean, the Nazis talking about Jews, the way they portrayed them was, well, these people are alien to the German homeland. They are alien to Europe. They are a pestilence. They don't have a legitimate blood claim to the land. This is the Nazi worldview. And so it became legitimate within the Nazi worldview. That was how they prepared the genocide, the steps of dehumanization. And
dehumanization.
And the idea that anyone without, a blood tie, a genuine blood connection to the land could just be slaughtered. I mean, these are Nazi views. And my problem with it is it's just like a wholesale rejection of the Enlightenment and, universal morality, and, it's a wholesale rejection of like what the left is supposed to stand for. Because when I signed up to the progressive cause, it was out of the idea that I believe that all human beings are born equal and should have equal dignity and worth and value. And that's what attracted me to the progressive movement, not the idea. And of course, these people aren't progressive. I mean, really, they're just almost like the flip side of fascism.
This is horseshoe theory.
It is really
horseshoe theory in action. The far left and the far right on very, very many issues end up joining up because the far right hates the Jews on racial anti-Semitism. The far left hates Israel on the basis of disagreeing with the concept of Zionism and believing that it should be deconstructed and dismantled, potentially in a violent way. And so they end up finding common cause together.
Well, I said this, right? What is the difference between, say, a Nick Fuentes of the far right, and of the anti-Semitic far right, and someone on the anti-Semitic far left? I mean, Nick Fuentes wants to kill every Jew on earth, but someone on the anti-Semitic far left, would agree with killing every Zionist, which is however many Jews. I mean, what, they'd save 1 or 2 million across the world, but still the death toll would still be comparable roughly. I mean, there's tens of millions of people who are still going to be slaughtered at the end of the day if the fantasies of both the far left, anti-Semitic far left and the anti-Semitic far right are realized.
I think anyone whose solution is mass slaughter is just disgusting and inhumane and wrong. And I think the solution is dialogue and peaceful compromise. That's really what I'm excited to promote. And I think that is where we're going to get the most gains if we can actually execute on doing it. Because we need to be builders, right? We need to build societies. We need to build coexistence. We need to build infrastructure. Both metaphorical infrastructure of connections between people, and also literal physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, houses. That's what society is made out of, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, if we want to argue about indigeneity forever, humans, evolved. What is it, like 600,000 years ago in the Rift Valley in Kenya? I think that's the anthropological, archaeological conclusion that we can reach.
Homo sapiens, yes.
All of the Israelis and Palestinians come from that root, right? All of the Africans come from that root. All of the Asians come from that root. All of the all of the Europeans, all of the Americans come from the same root. So we evolved together as a species, and we've moved around the earth, right? So ultimately, we have to think about, okay, we have evolved into tribes and countries, and that's fine. But the question should be, how do we coexist? How do we reach out to people who maybe disagree with us or don't see the world from the same perspective? And how do we reach a situation where we can coexist peacefully together? And I believe the answer is humanism, and emphasizing the things that we have in common, and not the things that divide us.
Yes, and I completely agree. And this is the problem. It's the anti-humanism on both the far left and the far right.
Absolutely.
Because, it's funny, right? Like, over the past few weeks, I've received hundreds of death threats from like Hamas nicks, etc. But I've also received all this abuse from neo-Nazis as well, because in response to people who were claiming, well, Drew's this Zionist controlled puppet, blah blah blah, he's paid off by the Jews. I put out a statement and I said, I want to be very clear. I believe in a Palestinian state. I also believe in a Jewish state. And I just listed out basically all like the national self-determination movements I support. And I support a whole range of them. I mean, I've spent years campaigning for a Tibetan state, a Uyghur state. I believe I support like a Kurdish state, for example. I just support like basically a range of, national self-liberation movements. I support a Taiwanese state. I support a state for the Hong Kongers. And I support, of course, obviously, I also support, Ukrainian independence. So I put out this statement, and in response, then some of the neo-Nazis in Australia, and there's a group called National Socialist Network, and unfortunately, they're growing in strength. Unfortunately, and they put out statements saying, like, Drew, you are like a Pakistani/Turkish, you are a white traitor. You're not white. Deport yourself from Australia, or we will deal with you. So I had within the span of 1 week, I had people on the far left who were saying, Drew, you're a settler colonist in Australia because your family background's Greek Cypriot, so go back to Europe. These were people on the far left. And then I also had neo-Nazis on the far right going, Drew, you're not white, leave Australia. So that's the fucked up thing. I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's actually scary and disturbing that there's so little. I mean, obviously they're coming at it from different ideological worldviews, but at the end of the day, like, they both believe in mass ethnic cleansing and mass population exchanges, etc. And a lot of people would be killed in the process of that. Like, this is what horrifies me about the extreme left and the extreme right.
I mean these extreme ideas, they do get a lot of clicks online. I think to some extent it's people gawking, because it's almost a similar, it's and LARPing, it's almost a similar effect to, you know, maybe some of the kind of radicalization we saw during the 2016 election, where people would say more and more ridiculous things in order to get clicks online, in order to get like attention and participation, whether that's comments, whether that's retweets. So people were saying the most ridiculous things, and then getting attention out of that. I think that's it's kind of a self-perpetuating spiral, because the more attention you get, the more further attention you get, because of look at how much attention you're getting. I mean, look what happens with Kanye. He says one anti-Semitic thing and it just blows up the internet, and then he goes on and says more anti-Semitic things. And it gets more and more ridiculous, and people are competing to say more and more extreme things, right?
Absolutely.
I think you do see that in the streams of some of the more wackadoodle Marxist Leninists that we see on Twitter. That they're pushing each other to be the most extreme, and who can condemn Israel in the most extreme terms. None of these people have any plans, by the way, to actually go and join Hamas or go and join Palestinian Islamic Jihad and go and actually fight for the cause that they claim to espouse, right? They are,
of course,
LARPers. Essentially,
it is live action role playing. Exactly.
Essentially, they're LARPers, and they have no, tangible plans to do anything other than stream on Twitch and make tweets. But it gets them attention, and that validates them in some way, and they're happy about that, and they feel like they've connected with an audience, and so that's the ridiculous thing that goes on and continues.
And you're so right about like how it's like almost like a perpetual flywheel of extremism, because like Bad Empanada, for example, like I literally saw him yesterday. There was a photo of the 2000 Ramallah lynching where like the organs of 2 IDF soldiers were literally ripped from their bodies, and people held up the organs in the air and stuff like that. And Bad Empanada, this Australian Greek man who lives like a seemingly normal life in Buenos Aires, this guy who's just like, he's just like, as you said, a LARPer. Like, he just literally lives in Buenos Aires. He's not fucking fighting for Hamas, but he's calling you a traitor, a race traitor to the Palestinians. And he was posting saying he endorsed the dismembering of occupying soldiers. And he actually said he explicitly endorsed like holding their organs in the air, which is just like, how do you even get to that point? Even if you, this is the crazy thing, even if you hate your enemy so much, at what point would you ever think to yourself that ripping like organs and limbs from limbs like makes you the good guy? Like,
I mean, it's not. This happened many years ago, right? This didn't free the Palestinian people, right? This didn't create Palestinian self-determination. It didn't improve the lot of people in Gaza today, right? Like,
it made things worse.
Atrocities have been going on in this part of the world for a very long time, and it hasn't actually solved the problem. And that's what I want to talk about, is that being constructive and trying to solve the ongoing problems that we're experiencing. And one of those, of course, is a lack of Palestinian self-determination, right? And military occupation in now both the West Bank and Gaza, right? I don't think there's any Palestinian in the world who's happy about that. Maybe Richard Hananiah, that's...
Oh, Richard Hananiah.
maybe one, but I'm certainly not happy to see military occupation, and that's an issue that we need to work on. But
that is literally the one single Palestinian on earth, I think, who supports the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It's literally Richard Hananiah.
Yeah, like, but you know, realistically, Palestinians don't want to be ruled in a military way by Israel, right?
Yes.
They want a Palestinian state, and the polls show that typically right now Palestinians want a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. But realistically, that's not going to happen. Realistically, there has to be a compromise, and you know, that's what we need to promote. And you know, killing Israeli soldiers or ripping people's bodies apart is not That's not gonna help any Palestinians. That's not gonna help any Palestinians. It does nothing to help Palestinians.
Of course, you know that meme where it's like, I just have to subsidize the men. It's like, how are you doing, son? And it's just like, I just need to subsidize the men. I just need to subsidize the men. And it's just like literally going schizophrenic and insane. It's like that, but I just need to commit one more atrocity, one more atrocity, one more atrocity, and it's going to somehow fix everything. And it never does.
It doesn't. It doesn't. And on the other hand, when you have you know what I was tweeting about this morning, right? Israeli soldiers in Jenin, they took over the mosque. They were disgusting. They were broadcasting Jewish prayers. I've got nothing against Jewish prayers, of course. But doing it in a mosque is inappropriate. And they were. I think one of them spray painted graffiti on the mosque. Yeah. And of course, we see disgusting events where, you know, anti-Semites spray paint graffiti on a synagogue. And that's horrendous. So of course, when it happens to a mosque, that's also horrendous.
Exactly. But the basic idea of reciprocity.
But you know, war crimes or atrocities or mistreatment of Palestinians hasn't solved problems for Israelis either, right?
Of course.
You know, there's not going to be a solution, a long-term secure solution for Israel that involves mistreating Palestinians, right?
Of course. And this was basically, I mean, that it was the lesson of October 7. Netanyahu believed that he could just put the issue forever on ice, and that
exactly.
And he thought that by, you know, setting Hamas against Fatah and, you know, encouraging divisions in that movement. I mean, for years he allowed Qatar to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars
to strengthen Hamas, to bolster Hamas. In his own words, reported by the Jerusalem Post in 2019, our strategy is to bolster Hamas by transferring Qatari cash.
Yes.
Those
were his words, yeah.
I think Netanyahu, this is why he kind of tried to be friendly with Orban and with Putin to some extent. He does envision this kind of worldwide alliance, and with Trump, of course, this worldwide alliance.
He also respects Xi Jinping as well. I mean, when Biden recently criticized, this was before October 7, but I still remember it a couple months back when Biden criticized Netanyahu, and it wasn't even a harsh criticism, it was actually quite a bleak criticism. And Netanyahu responded by inviting the Chinese ambassador over and literally like showing off that he was reading Xi Jinping's like memoirs or whatever, and talking up that his ties with the Chinese state.
But Netanyahu explicitly views himself as a advocate for strongman, right? Whether typically it will be right-wing strongman. Hamas, whether they're far right or far left, Hamas actually have elements of both. But I would see his support, his wanting to bolster Hamas as part of that frame of reference, right?
Yes.
He for the same reason as you might want to look up to Putin, look up to Xi Jinping, you would see Hamas as a right-wing or right-wing, left-wing, like strongman nationalist movement. I mean, that's what Sinwar and Hania and all of the leaders of Hamas would view themselves as. They would view themselves as strongmen. So
absolutely.
To some extent, it's reasonable to ask the question: Did Netanyahu view Hamas as part of this alliance of, you know, nationalist leaders that he wants to be a part of?
No, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to Netanyahu, I've been a strident critic of him for years, and you know, I am absolutely opposed to his government. I'm opposed to people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich being in any Israeli government. I mean, back in the day, they used to actually ban the Kahanist parties as terrorists because, you know, the Kahanists were basically terrorists. And Ben Gvir, for many years, he had a portrait in his home of Baruch Goldstein, the extremist West Bank settler.
I didn't know that. That makes him even more disgusting to me than I previously realized.
He's disgusting. I mean, for many years, he had a portrait in his sitting room of Baruch Goldstein, the far right extremist Jewish settler.
Murdered Palestinians, Tomb of the Patriarchs.
It was a terrorist attack. It was a terrorist attack on innocent Palestinians. He shot babies and kids. Like so, I honestly view Ben Gvir as a terrorist supporter himself, a terrorist sympathizer.
Yeah, and I think that this alliance of strongmen that we're kind of putatively talking about is ultimately anti-humanist. because it's not about bringing people together, and it's not about solving our common problems. It's about Hamas, we can transfer this cash to Hamas, and Hamas will sit and do their thing, and the Palestinians will be divided, and there won't be a two-state solution. But it blew up in Netanyahu's face, and this is the problem. This is the problem.
And a lot of Israelis themselves say that Netanyahu has blood on his hands, and he bears part of the responsibility for October 7. I mean, the disaster, the utter catastrophe, which is basically the worst security failing in the entire history of Israel.
Absolutely.
It is a huge portion of it rests on Netanyahu's shoulders, because he was the one that set the Israeli society against each other for years with his far right authoritarian politics. I mean, the judicial protests. I mean, people feared that Israel was on the verge of a civil war up until last year because of the nature of his attempts to. I doubt it would have got as far as a civil war, right? Course.
But there was definitely really severe tensions in Israeli society. But
absolutely,
to me, I cannot believe that the West and Israel and the Arab world have allowed for so long Gaza to be subjugated by Hamas, because we know they're a terrorist group. We've known they're a terrorist group. We know that they got to power in Gaza ultimately through a coup and killing members of Fatah, right? Yeah. And to see the toleration of this Iranian-backed terrorist group for so long, to the extent to the point where the only thing that triggered their downfall was a massacre of over 1,000 people, the majority of whom were civilians. It's shocking. Where were the UN? Where were the UN? Right?
Yeah.
Where was the EU? Where was the UK? Where was the USA to say that this is not acceptable? We need to have international peacekeepers. For example, that could have been a solution for Gaza, right? It didn't have to be an Israeli occupation. It could have been international peacekeepers, and the UN should have been leading on this, because this was always going to lead to disaster.
Of course,
this was always going to lead to disaster. Where having Hamas ruling Gaza, when we know what Hamas's goals are, which is the destruction, the violent destruction of Israel.
And this is also part of the problem, right? And it's stunning because Bernie Sanders himself articulated this, and he's a democratic socialist, and so many on the far left said, we're now against Bernie Sanders, he's a genocide apologist, etc. But Bernie Sanders himself said, how do we have a permanent ceasefire with Hamas when every single day they're basically boasting that they're going to carry out another October 7? They've repeatedly boasted of that since carrying out October 7. And so how do you actually have a permanent ceasefire with that? And this is part of the problem, right? I mean,
for many years, I was hoping ultimately Hamas were going to moderate their views, right? Also, I admit, I was probably hoping that, okay, they've been in power for this point of time, for this long amount of time. At some point, they're going to come out and say, okay, we should just moderate our views. We should have a two-state solution. And yes, we're Islamists. Yes, we are. Some of our views are a bit extreme, but we're going to moderate our views. But that hasn't happened. They've actually got more extreme.
Well, it's a horrible thing, and even, I mean, the Israeli government miscalculated on that, because they thought somehow that Hamas had moderated in power in governing Gaza, but obviously, just such a horrific miscalculation. And exactly as you said, there are Islamist political parties in Israel. I mean, there are literally Islamist political parties in Israel that represent Arab Israelis. And so
Ram is led by Mansour Abbas, right? And I believe his faction is an offshoot, actually, like Hamas, of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it is possible. It is possible for it is, and he now rejects violence, as you said. So it is possible for people with Islamist views to reach a more peaceful and reconciliatory position, as I think Mansour Abbas is showing. I think he's doing a great job promoting peace at this point. And as I said, he is part of another Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. So
and of course, like we also can't ignore. It's such a complicated picture, right? Because he was actually part of a coalition government in Israel, which is incredible. I mean, it's a very complex picture, right? Because, and this is what I said. I had a Twitter space with some of these Marxist-Leninists, etc., and they were asking me to say that Israel was an apartheid state, and I believe that the situation in the West Bank and Gaza is basically apartheid, because obviously, if you're a Palestinian civilian in the West Bank and you don't have any legal or political or civil rights, and you're living under military occupation, what else can you call it other than, you know, a system of deliberate inequality and discrimination based on ethnicity? I mean, that is.
I have been for a long time. I've been an advocate of using the term apartheid to refer to the West Bank in particular.
Yeah.
But a friend of mine, you know, maybe a year or two ago, suggested to me, actually, the most accurate term is probably not apartheid; it's actually military occupation.
Fair enough.
Because apartheid is an analogy. There are definitely some serious similarities, right, between the South African apartheid regime and the situation in the West Bank. We don't deny that, and this is a legitimate grievance, and this is what we need to solve through negotiation.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, probably the most accurate term, in my opinion, at least, based upon the facts on the ground, is military occupation. So that's what I tend to refer to it as. But of course, people are going to refer to it as apartheid.
Yeah, look, I was going to say that, like, while I see the situation in, say, the West Bank and Gaza as effectively apartheid, I was going to say that the situation within the borders of 1967, within 1967 border Israel,
it's not apartheid, no.
Yeah, because Palestinian Israelis or Arab Israelis, like, you know, they've actually been members of the Supreme Court. They've literally been part of a coalition government, and this is part of the problem, right? Where I think sometimes there's this huge temptation by people to just sort of collapse all terms and definitions, and they also want to collapse the complexity of Israeli societies, and they want to pretend that there is no such thing as the Israeli left or the Israeli peace movement, and they want to pretend that, you know, there are no Arab Israelis and that they haven't been part of coalition governments, etc. And as you said, when you're talking about this Mansour Abbas, it is interesting, and I was going to say as well, we do have to note as well, because of racists like Ben Gvir, he railed against him entering the coalition government, and he called him a terrorist in parliament and stuff like that. So obviously there are still, you know, horrible racists and on the extreme far right of Israeli politics that are trying very desperately to try and marginalize Arab Israelis. And obviously as well, there was a terrible pogrom like that we saw this earlier this year as well. So there's still huge problems of discrimination and racism as exist in all societies on earth. But I think when people try to say that Israel is like sort of like the uniquely most evil state on the face of the planet.
Oh, that's very weird.
I mean, that's where I think it starts to head into like the sort of blood libel, like sort of anti-Semitic territory.
Absolutely. Like, you know, if you want to talk about the 5.4 million people killed in the Congo, and you want to say that Israel's more evil than that, that's very, 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 very peculiar. There, you know, there is this saying, "No Jews, no news." And a lot of attention gets put on what happens between Israel and Palestine. And obviously, as a Palestinian myself, I hate what's happening. I hate all the violence there. But there are some incredibly massive atrocities and mass killings that do not get any attention from the Western media and from people who claim to be pro-Palestine supporters.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is a source of you know, great disappointment and bitterness for me, for example, because like basically from 2019 onwards, I've spent years of my life dedicating a huge portion of my life basically like campaigning for Hong Kongers and Uyghurs and Tibetans. And really like 2019, these were big issues, and I feel like they've kind of like now fallen off the radar. And you know, people don't like talking about what's happening to the Uyghurs, and people don't even talk about what's happening to Tibet. Like it doesn't even really ever appear in the news, and it's just shocking to me that there are millions of people like I exactly as you said. I hate what's happening right now in Gaza, and I do believe that the IDF has committed war crimes, and I do and I do believe that there has been, you know, collective punishment. And you know,
absolutely.
You brought up the case of you know, racist IDF soldiers who were you know, chanting their prayers in a mosque.
over the intercom, broadcasting it to the whole community outside the mosque.
Yeah, that was actually in the West Bank, and
in Jenin, yeah.
And as you said, I mean, this is basically like a very basic principle of reciprocity. If you wouldn't want that to be done to a synagogue, if you wouldn't want someone to defile and desecrate a synagogue, then surely you must understand why it hurts Muslims to see a mosque desecrated. And so, like, I try really hard to see where there are injustices impacting both Palestinians and Israelis. October 7, I've spent weeks railing against, Hamas supporters online, but I have tried my hardest to also criticize Netanyahu, Likud, the far right in Israel. And, there are people, I mean, even just the other day we saw, I think it was it the Israeli ambassador to the UK who said straight up that they would not support a two-state solution.
And my question to her, and it still stands, is then what is your solution? How are Palestinians going to get their civil rights? How are we going to get self-determination? If there cannot be a two-state solution, what does it become? And my answer usually is that if it's a one-state solution and Palestinians do not have equal rights, it becomes a traditional civil rights battle where we take on non-violent, peaceful resistance.
Yes.
Right, for the explicit task, not of creating, Palestine one state, river to the sea, but equal rights for Palestinians under the law that we live under. Right?
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Because if it is a military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, pending the creation of a future Palestinian state, that's one thing. But if it's a military occupation that's never going to end, right, that's very, very different. Right,
yes,
that's us being permanently stripped of our rights, and we can't accept that. No human being will accept being a second-class citizen.
Yes, absolutely, and this is the horrible thing. I do try my hardest to empathize with Palestinians, and I can understand from their perspective, seeing over the past 2 decades how the settlements have continued, and it is very obviously the policy of the Netanyahu government for more than, for basically 2 decades. I mean, even since Oslo, there has been basically a policy by Israeli governments of always kicking the can down the road. And basically the occupation goes on, and year after year, the space for Palestinians shrinks and shrinks. So I can understand why there is so much anger and frustration. And I can understand why, as you said, why people want to fight back, but it's just so, for me, as you said, it is just very clearly about peaceful, non-violent methods of resistance, civil disobedience, and protecting civilians everywhere, whether they be Palestinian or Israeli. And I think it's very, this is difficult, right? Because I can definitely see the argument where people say, well, Drew, you're this, you're fine because you're living in Australia and you're not living under oppression, you haven't had family members killed, etc. So it's easy for you to say, and I can understand that. I'm not trying to be pig-headed. I'm trying to understand as well, and I can see their perspective and stuff like that. It's just that from my perspective, being a humanist, being somebody who believes in the value and worth of every human life,
absolutely.
And I'm not even necessarily a pacifist, right? Because I really, really strongly supported Ukraine fighting back and trying to defend itself, right? I believe in the right to self-defense.
I'm not a pacifist either. I may be closer to being a pacifist than the majority of people, but neither am I a pacifist.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I do think Palestinians, for example, do have a right to self-defense. But people,
I agree.
But the problem is people twist it and they try to say that October 7 was self-defense, and never in a million years. It's not self-defense to kill.
Atrocities are never self-defense. If there is a Palestinian right to violent resistance, which I believe there is under international law, it has to also be proportionate, right? Yes. And it has to only target military infrastructure and the Israeli military, because that's the issue, is military occupation. Now, personally, I do not advocate for this. I do not advocate for the violent struggle, because in my view, every single death takes us further away from peace.
Yes, I agree.
That's where I am on this particular conflict right now. I do not see the violent struggle by Palestinians in any way as being productive.
Yes, I agree with you, John. And look, I've seen many people argue this, and they say it to me. They say, well, you're being a hypocrite because you support Ukraine's right to fight back, but you don't support Palestinians' right to fight back. This is the thing, right? The people don't realize this but the first massacres that took place in basically in the Israel-Palestine conflict, basically took place in the 1910s. Like, it's been going on for more than a century now. There's been more than a century now of, like, basically round after round of ethnic massacres, revenge killings, ethnic massacres, bombings, terrorism. And so if violence was going to solve anything, it would have solved it by now, you'd think, after more than a century of this. And I do think there is a distinction, there is a difference in that with Ukraine, the whole thing could be ended tomorrow if Russia withdrew to the internationally recognized borders.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Ukraine isn't invading Russia. Ukraine just wants to defend its right to exist. And then I can understand people say, well, they're just trying to defend Palestine's right to exist, etc. No one can look at October 7 as, you see this all over Twitter. You still see people say, and you see Hamas supporters claim that October 7 was this great military victory. But where is the military victory? It has resulted in it's
destruction of Gaza. Destruction of Gaza. That's the reality of October 7th. A lot of my position is founded on pragmatism, right?
Yeah.
Like it's impossible. It's impossible for Hamas to win a military victory.
Yes,
military to military against the IDF. The IDF is a modern military with American support. Hamas are guerrilla fighters, right?
Yes.
This is not going to solve anything for Palestinians, right? All it does is prolong the conflict, and more deaths and more anger and more cycle of violence and more hatred. And that's not what we need. What we need is peace and reconciliation. And at some point there's going to have to be that between Ukraine and Russia as well, by the way. I'm pro Ukraine, right? I think the war in Ukraine was caused by the Russian invasion, right?
Yes.
The correct remedy for the Russian citizens in the east of Ukraine was always going to be peaceful remedies and not Russian invasion.
Yes.
But maybe they do have some legitimate grievances, but at the end of the day, between Ukraine and Russia, I would say the same thing. We need to find a peaceful remedy, and that's going to be very difficult when you've got someone like Vladimir Putin who is hell bent on subjugating Ukraine, right? But at the end of the day, we have to advocate for something to stop the killing and let people return to normal, peaceful lives.
Yes, look, this is the thing, right? I'm a massive supporter of Ukraine, but if the Ukrainians were to do what Hamas did on October 7, like,
we condemn it.
Yeah, of course I would condemn it. Of course I would condemn it.
If they went into Russia and they slaughtered Russian civilians, we condemn it in exactly the same way.
Exactly. I would never support that. And to the credit of the Ukrainians, they have recognized that keeping the moral high ground in their fight against Russia is so important to maintaining international support.
Absolutely.
And so this is part of the problem, right? Like, people feel so justified in their rage, and a lot of the times they are justified in their rage, but you also have to keep a sense of perspective, and you have to be a strategist, right? If in any resistance movement, you have to be a strategist.
Exactly. And I'm a strategist. Essentially, my argument to the Palestinian people is I am a strategist. I am advocating for the Palestinian people to get our civil rights and our human freedom in the most effective, efficient, and kindest and most humane way possible, so that we have support from the international community, and we have support from America, and we have support from Britain, and we have support from Australia, right? That is what Palestinians actually need in order to secure our freedom, right?
Yes.
And that's what I'm advocating for. And people who call me, names about, he's a traitor to the Palestinian cause, don't understand what I'm doing. They don't understand that I'm actually advocating the most efficient and effective way for Palestinians to win Palestinian freedom.
Yes, no, I completely agree. And I honestly believe people will call me naive for this, and they have called me naive for this, but I genuinely believe that if the Palestinian resistance had pursued the same tactics as, say, Mandela or Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., there would already be a Palestinian state. I genuinely believe that.
I think it's much more likely. I think that
of course you would still obviously have the
there are still going to be obstacles. There are still going to be obstacles, and
there'll still be people like Ben Gvir.
If the Palestinian the pro-Palestine movement can manifest in a way that is more like either the movement of Mandela or the movement of Dr. King, I think that's going to give us a much stronger chance to create a Palestinian state. It's not going to be Palestine from the river to the sea. It is going to be some kind of two-state solution. And maybe some people will say I'm naive, or we're naive, because we're talking about a two-state solution, and the current Israeli government is denying that's a possibility. And no doubt what Zippy Hotovelli and Netanyahu and so forth are saying is making my life harder. It's making your life harder.
Of course.
In advocating for a compromise, because they're saying there can never be a compromise. And so the Hamas supporters are like, what choice do we have? We have to fight them. We have to die. And I mean, it's kind of being between a rock and a hard place.
It is really hard.
Walking the middle path is really hard. It's really hard because you.
it is genuinely really difficult, because like a century of intercommunal violence and round after round of revenge massacres, it breeds just absolute hatred. And
absolutely.
And there are I believe that Netanyahu hates Palestinians, just as I believe that Hamas hates all Israelis.
It's hard. I would say it's hard to read people's minds to know exactly what's in their heart.
Yeah.
But his policies have certainly not been helpful to Palestinians. No.
I think unfortunately that he's devoted 2 decades of his life to trying to block this. I mean, you go back to Rabin during Oslo, and Netanyahu was appearing at rallies where people were basically pushing up coffins with Rabin's face on it and threatening to kill Rabin for the crime of negotiating Oslo, which in itself, Oslo was actually very moderate and
very moderate.
I mean, I can understand as well. It's very difficult, right? You've got the extremists on both sides, because I can understand the argument that the Israelis were never serious about Oslo because, the PA has never really had effective governance, and the settlements kept on going, and Rabin was still supporting settlements right up through Oslo, etc. But then at the same time, you also had Hamas fighters carrying out suicide bombing attacks against buses to try and blow up the peace process during Oslo. So it's hard, because you have extremists in both camps who were basically almost colluding. Like this is the crazy thing. Netanyahu and Hamas back in the 90s were colluding to block the peace process, even back then.
And if we're going to return to a similar peace process, and if we're going to succeed at it, it's going to be the same thing, right? You're going to have the extremists on both sides trying to block it.
Yeah, and I also anticipate the criticisms where people will say, well, you spent all this time criticizing, Palestinian resistance and criticizing, Palestinian anger, etc., while the balance of atrocities right now are being perpetrated by the IDF. And I can understand that.
Absolutely.
And I agree. Right now, there is an absolutely mammoth humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
It's terrible.
And
it's terrible.
And I opposed the bombing from October 7. I said, I actually said, I hate Hamas and I want to see Hamas go. But you also have to understand, heeding the lessons that the West learned during the war on terror, when you act out of rage and you act without strategy and you just want to lash out and make someone feel the pain that you're feeling, well, the West got bogged down. America got bogged down for decades. They got bled out in the desert for decades. And it's also...
Don't act out of anger. It's really important, from the Israeli side, to think strategically, right? If they really want to have peace with the Palestinians, think about the most effective strategies to achieve peace, because carpet bombing Gaza, destroying 60% of the buildings, it's going to store up a lot of anger with Palestinians, right? It's going to be more anger with Palestinians against Israel. Even there are Palestinian, just as there were Israeli peace activists who were killed on October the 7th.
Yes,
there are Palestinian peace activists whose families have been obliterated and killed in in this ongoing war, right?
That's a very good point.
When you lose,
Ahmed, I think his name is
Ahmed Al-Khatib,
yeah,
a guy who I've talked to a little bit. I know a little bit about him. Ahmed Al-Khatib. His family recently was killed by an Israeli bomb.
Yeah, dozens of them, and it's an atrocity. It is an atrocity.
Nightmare.
And this is a guy who spent more than a decade opposing Hamas and opposing violent resistance, and he's a voice of humanity. And you also see, Hamas slaughtered people like Vivian Silva, who had devoted decades of her life to the peace process,
to helping Palestinians.
Yeah, and even supporting Gazans in particular. So this is one of the most horrible tragedies of the whole thing. On October 7th, it was like Hamas deliberately targeted the peace camp in Israel because, these kibbutzes were like filled with left-wing peace advocates who fucking hated Netanyahu. Like Netanyahu hated them. And it's borne out by the fact that since October 7th happened, he refused to meet so many of the hostages' families. And, it's horrible. You've even seen like the Israeli far right sometimes troll the family members of Israeli hostages because, these are like these are camps that are basically these are people.
Right. Yes. I know what you're talking about.
They're the pro-peace camp. And so many of them have come out and said, we don't want the murder of our loved ones to be avenged with, just mass atrocities. And the Israeli far right has actually trolled and attacked and harassed some of these families.
Yeah, I have heard about that.
And also likewise,
unbelievable, really, if you think about it.
Yeah,
these people would have lost their family members. Their family members would have been kidnapped into Gaza. And on one side you have Hamas doing that, and on the other side you have extremists mocking you effectively, mocking you. Oh, you were a peacenik, so you deserve it.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
It's sick. And as you brought up, Ahmed, this is a guy who basically spent more than a decade opposing Hamas, and he's constantly been accused of being a traitor to the Palestinians, and he's constantly been accused of being a race traitor, etc., because he lives in America as a refugee, and he's very strongly opposed to Hamas. And still still sadly, dozens of his family members were killed in what appears to have been a completely indiscriminate strike, and so many thousands have been killed in indiscriminate strikes. And there is a policy of collective punishment very clearly. And the fact that peace activists and their families are the ones that have been slaughtered is just so horrendous. And I've actually talked to, I was recently talking to a Palestinian doctor who was in Gaza, who lived in Gaza, and she worked in Israel studying child heart surgery to take the skills back to Gaza. And when October 7th happened, she utterly condemned it, and she hates Hamas. And she was telling me so many people in Gaza dislike Hamas, they hate Hamas, but obviously they live under a regime of terror and fear, and not many people can actually say that. I believe there was a survey, and it was like a representative scientific survey that was taken just prior to October 7th, and they found that, a huge portion of the population of Gaza had absolutely no confidence in Hamas as a governing organization. So there are thousands upon thousands of people here who have been slaughtered and have been brutally killed, who have nothing to do with Hamas and want nothing to do with Hamas. And that is a tragedy. And this is also the problem, as you said, the Israelis, they are acting out of terror. This is what I've tried to say to people, right? People try and say, well, you have to understand that Hamas is a response to decades of violence, and so their militancy is. And they were saying, oh, so many Hamas fighters are, orphans. They had family members killed and stuff like that.
Of course, that's true.
So yeah, and it's true. And so people say, well, that is a response to decades of violence and repression and persecution. And so that is why they have become militants. And I can obviously I still condemn it, but I can also understand it on a rational level. Because look, if I was to be brought up under such horrible conditions, obviously I'd hope that I'd still have the same values I have now. But people obviously, when they're brought up under such extreme conditions, it obviously changes you. But also, I've tried to say this to people as well. So that these same people who say that Hamas is an understandable reaction to decades of Israeli violence, and on one level I can rationally understand that, but then at the same time they will say that Israeli violence is just the product of almost like primordial Jewish evil. It's like, no, you also have to understand that Israeli militancy is equally a response to decades of violence, you know?
There were massacres of Jews in the 1920s, 1930s, long before the start of the state of Israel,
Massacres
right?
going on and on and on for decades, suicide bombing attacks going on and on for decades.
Yeah.
And people try and say, well, the Holocaust has absolutely nothing to do with it, but because it was a European crime, not a Palestinian crime. And that may be true, but when you still have a population where still so many people have grandparents who were slaughtered, that is obviously a mass trauma that is going to continue.
Mass trauma, and this is the issue, right? There is extreme mass trauma on both sides. On both sides, we're both extremely traumatized and extremely mentally disturbed by what's happened in both directions.
Yes.
So we have, from my perspective, we have to have truth and reconciliation.
Yes.
We have to sit down together. We have to air our legitimate grievances, and we have to negotiate for a better future where both sides can live peacefully together. That has to be the long-term solution. And people can, they can accuse me of saying platitudes, but these are not platitudes. These are very, very difficult, concrete, material steps that we have to take. Right? We have to listen to each other's collective trauma. We have to listen to each other's collective needs. We have to recognize each other's collective needs, right? To live in peace together. And we have to, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, right? That's what it has to be based upon. It has to be based upon, I give one thing, you give one thing, and then we can establish a situation where we can live peacefully together, and we can start to bury our trauma, and we can start to resolve our trauma.
And this is, I honestly see this as such a reasonable and rational thing to argue, but it's people who are like yourself, who argue it that are the ones that are being attacked, and it's unfortunate because you get attacked by the extremists on both sides.
When you stick your head above the parapet, right? I knew that this was going to come, right? I wouldn't have done what I've done, right, in terms of advocating for peace, in terms of advocating for reconciliation, in terms of advocating for a situation where we live together peacefully. I wouldn't have done that if I didn't know, without knowing that there were going to be abusive messages sent my way, right? I fully understood that this was going to happen. I fully understood that it was a consequence of expressing my views, and I was ready for it, to be honest. To be quite honest, the only thing that surprised me is that I expected probably a lot more would come from right-wing Israelis, and actually a lot more than I expected has actually come from the Western left. Western leftists with, LARPing at being Marxist-Leninists are by far my most vehement critics. And it is what it is. I expected a certain level of abuse and a certain level of undignified commentary coming my way, and that that's fine, because I so strongly believe in what I'm speaking about, right? I believe that this actually is the only reasonable pathway towards resolving these incredibly traumatic, incredibly crazy, incredibly destructive issues that we're having. And it's not going to only come from one side, right? The solution's not going to be one side. The solution needs to be both sides saying, people on both sides saying, we are ready to make peace. And me as a Palestinian saying I'm ready to make peace hopefully will help people on the Israeli side to say I'm ready to make peace too, right? And so it's kind of, this is a mutual process of recognition and reconciliation, and it's going to take a long time, and it's not going to end with me. It's probably this may take decades and decades and decades, and there's probably still going to be a lot more bloodshed to come, unfortunately, which we don't want to see. We want to see peace, but this process has to start, right? And someone has to start it. And so what I say is, to anyone who's a peaceful humanist in Israel or Palestine who cares about the humanity of people on the other side, we have to start this process of peace and reconciliation and truth and reconciliation.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, this is the thing, right? You know that you're going to inevitably get such hateful abuse, etc. And look, I rationally had nothing to gain whatsoever by commenting on this conflict. I mean, my main issue has been, since I started, China and Russia, etc. And really sadly, and it breaks my heart a bit. I had thousands of Muslim followers because of my activism over the Uyghur genocide stuff over the years. And sadly, a lot of them have turned against me and say, "Wow, Drew, like we had respect for you, and now we see that you're just a campist and you have no human right, you have no belief in, you know, human dignity, etc. You're a hypocrite. It really makes me sad, you know, that sort of thing. And I've gained nothing from it. I've just basically alienated people, and I've had thousands of people unfollow me and stuff like that. But
as a peace activist, right? As someone who wants to see peace, I believe that your heart really is in peace, and I think you do care about peace and humanitarianism, and that's why you criticize both sides, right? And well, that's why you're being a voice for the innocent people on both the Palestinian and the Israeli sides. So, you know, as a Palestinian, and I only speak for myself. You know, people will always claiming to speak for all Palestinians. That's not true. I only speak for myself. But speaking for myself, I want to thank you for your activism in helping both the peaceful people in Israel and in Palestine.
Well, thank you, John, and likewise. And I was going to say, like going into this, like, honestly, it would have been easier for me to just say nothing. But
of course,
it's obviously such a intractable and difficult and morally complex problem, and I felt I couldn't turn away from it. And what I was going to say is, to be honest, it's actually shifted a lot of my views as well, because in the past, I would be so sometimes militant about, we're going to have an independent Tibet, we're going to have an independent East Turkestan, fuck the CCP, etc. And I, of course, I still believe in that, you know, but also, like, when I see people start saying, like, you know, decolonization is mass ethnic expulsions and stuff like that, I had to clarify, like, when I support a free Tibet, or when I support a free East Turkestan for the Uyghurs, I only do so on the idea that, you know, the Han Chinese, and a lot of them are, like, legitimately, like actually, according to the left-wing definition, they are settler colonists. However, they still, that's their home. I don't believe in population.
They still have human rights. They still have human rights.
That's what I was going to say. Like,
they're ultimately, they're individuals, right? They're individuals. Exactly. They're not like carving up society into, oh, this set of people are settler colonists and this set of people are indigenous. I think that is a recipe for fighting.
Yes.
More than anything else.
And I was going to say, like,
fighting.
Exactly. And I was going to say, like it's made me really reflect, like, and I wanted to emphasize, like, basically, like, when I support a free Tibet and when I support a free East Turkestan and stuff like that, I'm so adamant, like, the human rights of Chinese civilians who are already living there have to be protected. And we're not going to be talking about population expulsion. We're not going to be talking about, you know, persecution. And, you know, I don't support any of the tactics used by Hamas. And it's made me, you know, for example, as well, like, once one of my infamous protests over the years, like, I once held up a sign that said "fuck Xi Jinping," and I did it in this area called Eastwood in Sydney, and it was like, it was legitimately just like a random suburb in Sydney. I wasn't targeting anyone based on ethnicity. I was there because my Tibetan friend was running for parliament, and I was there alongside her. And it's a very multicultural community. And so there were Chinese guys who, like, you know, were there with me as on the pro-democracy side, who were supporting me. My Taiwanese Han friend wrote the sign in Mandarin for me. You know, there were, at the same time, I got nationalists who sort of, like, saw me and they started fighting me, and, like, they tried to bash me up and everything.
Right.
And a lot of people in the aftermath online, they condemned, you know, like, the fact that I got attacked, but also equally, there are a lot of people who were trying to say, like, well, Drew, you went into this area that had, like, you know, very multicultural composition. There were a lot of Chinese Australians there, therefore you were targeting Chinese Australians. And honestly, like, especially as I've seen in recent weeks, how there have been Palestinian activists who've just targeted random Jewish businesses and stuff like that. And also, like, sadly, we see this in Australia, like, there have been sort of, like, pro-Palestine convoys that have just targeted suburbs that have, like, large Jewish populations and stuff like that.
Right. And that's wrong.
Yeah, it's really wrong, and it made me reflect on my past activism and think, like, shit. I still think, like, holding a sign saying "fuck Xi Jinping" is appropriate and it's fine. You can do that, but I should have done it in just, like, the middle of Sydney CBD, the central business district, rather than in Eastwood. And it made me reflect upon it, you know, and making sure that in the future I have to be so clear in all my activism that I don't want any. It's not about marginalizing Chinese.
Right.
It's not about marginalizing, you know, Chinese people whatsoever. It's always just saying we're against the government, not the people.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And from my point of view, I want to be able to say that my criticisms are not of a random Israeli, right?
Yes.
They're of Benjamin Netanyahu and you know, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And my criticisms of Hamas are not criticisms of a random Palestinian person who just wants to eat his falafel and, you know, drink his coffee. They're of, you know, Ismail Haniyeh, you know, Yahya Sinwar, that's, you know, Khalid Mashal. That's who I'm criticizing. It's not.
Yes.
It's not random Palestinian people. It's not
Exactly.
random Israelis. We need to, because
Yes.
the ordinary people are not 100% political, right?
Yeah.
Ordinary Chinese people in Australia are not.
No way.
You
Of
know,
course.
they're not representatives of Xi Jinping. In fact,
No, absolutely not.
very often, if they left China, they might be someone who disagrees with
Yes.
with
And that
the
is
Chinese
often the
Communist
case.
Party.
Exactly.
Probably the people who are most passionate about disagreeing with the Chinese Communist Party are the people who would tend to want to leave China. So
Yes, absolutely.
it's really important from my point of view to try to criticize both sides and try to not marginalize or dehumanize the average person in the street. Not dehumanize anyone, but not marginalize the average person in the street.
This might sound crazy. Maybe people might even criticize me for it, but like, it made me reflect, because in the past, like, being such a strong supporter of the Ukrainian cause, I probably at times fell into the camp of like dehumanizing Russians, and like it's made me reflect a lot. Like just seeing the sort of like ethnic-based hatreds that we've seen over the past months, like it's made me reflect a lot. And obviously, I'm against Putin rather than the Russian people.
A lot of Russian people lost a lot of kids in this war. It's a horrible war.
Yeah, and
it's a horrible war.
And I was going to say, John, like in the past, like I would have celebrated when Ukraine blew up a Russian tank or whatever, and obviously I'm still for expelling. I'm absolutely still for Ukraine's self-defense, fighting back against an invasion, expelling the invaders.
Self-determination. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I support Ukraine's military defense against an invading power, of course, but I probably wouldn't in the future, like engage in that type of laughing when a tank gets blown up, because I mean,
that is someone's son in there, right? That is someone's son.
Yeah, it's hard because obviously, like, the Russian soldiers have been responsible for really horrendous atrocities, etc. And obviously, if you're a tank crew, you're literally there to wage a war. But at the same time, like it's even made me think about I went too far even in dehumanizing Russian soldiers, and people criticize me for that and say like, oh, that's crazy because like they're all evil, and look, a lot of them are evil, but like it has made me actually reflect and potentially like I think I've actually come to value humanism more over the past 2 months, watching, like, being really involved in following the Israel-Palestine thing made me really value humanism much more.
From my perspective, the issue with Russia is the Russian government and the Russian government's ideology of it's kind of a Russian supremacism, right?
Yeah,
it's this idea that they have primacy over not just what's defined as the Russian Federation today, but everything that was in the former Soviet Union, right? Including Ukraine. So I think that's what I would tend to want to stick my criticism to, which is the ideology of the Russian government, rather than random Russian people who may or may not even believe in it.
Yeah, look, I never went to the point where I attacked Russian people themselves, but I do remember that, like, you'd see a video of like a Ukrainian, like, sort of the Ukrainians blowing up a Russian tank, and I would have celebrated that. And then like now I'm like I still support Ukraine fighting back this invasion. I still support Ukraine doing that because unfortunately they do. I'm not a pacifist, and I understand they literally have to like blow up these tanks, but I now view it like the whole thing is a human tragedy. It's sad that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, like, their families will never see them again. It's just the whole thing is horrific.
Yeah, and I mean this is why I consider myself to be an activist against war, right? War in general is very, very, very bad, and we should take every possible measure to abolish violent conflict and sort our differences out peacefully.
Yes, absolutely. We can probably wrap it up soon, but I was going to just, before we wrap it up, I was going to just mention, like, my family are Greek Cypriot, right? And they came to Australia in the 60s, and their plan was to just work in Australia for a couple of years and then go back to Cyprus. And my grandmother's brother, my yaya's brother, fought for IOCA, which was the Greek Cypriot national resistance against British colonialism. And he was arrested for smuggling dynamite against the British, and he was ultimately killed by a Turkish sniper. And I always thought, like,
wow.
I always thought I really admire like the fact that he fought against colonialism and he fought for the independence of Cyprus. It's really cool. I was always very proud of that family history. And, you know, my family, my yaya, unfortunately, you know, she was like absolutely traumatized by the death of her brother. And like, it basically made her hate politics for her entire life. Like from the moment I started being an actor, she would just say, just give it up. Like, people kill you. Like, it's like her trauma, you know, like it's tougher. Anyway, like, so I was raised basically by a Greek Cypriot family, and there was a lot of trauma on that family because they literally had they had family members that were killed, and like they came to Australia for a couple of years just to work, but then the Turkish military invaded. There was an ethnic cleansing of 300,000 Greek Cypriots from the north. My family didn't lose their homes because they were from the south, but we had like, you know, extended family that lost their homes. There's no right of return. To be honest, there's a lot of analogies with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because, unfortunately, you know, I was raised as a Greek Cypriot where we were told, well, Cyprus is Greek and we had the legitimate right, like we had the legitimate cause and we were the ones that were mistreated. This is what I was taught growing up. But then growing up, I also begun to read more and more, and I learned that, you know, there was the first iteration of the Greek Cypriot national liberation resistance, etc., called IOKA A. And that's where my grandmother's brother fought and he died. But then subsequently, there was a breakaway called like IOKA B, and they were basically like a fascist splinter group, and it was founded by Grivas, who was the man who founded the first iteration of IOKA. But basically, like, these were the guys that were full-on fascists. They wanted to purge. They wanted to purge Turkish Cypriots from their homes, and it's really sad. My Bapu told me when he was young, he left school very early, like grade 3, because his family was poor, so he was like a laborer, and he would go to the villages, and he would be working in a Turkish Cypriot village, and they'd sleep out in the open air because it was so safe and so peaceful, and people had lived side by side as brothers and sisters basically for centuries. Like, you know, intercommunally, they were very connected. But he grew to see basically the intercommunal violence and people slaughtering each other based on their race. And my grandmother's brother died, killed by a Turkish sniper. And, you know, then we had family members, that extended family, who were ethnically cleansed from homes, basically. But I was also reading, like, and it was horrible to discover this, right? You get raised as a Greek Cypriot Australian, and you're taught, you know, we were the ones that were wronged, etc., etc. But I read about how IOKA B, that fascist splinter movement, they did slaughter Turkish villages. They killed entire villages of Turkish Cypriots and kids, and it's horrific. And when that's your side, you know, your side perpetrates an atrocity, there's such a temptation, obviously, to turn the other way, say it's propaganda, to ignore it, right? But I can't ignore the fact that Greek Cypriots did unfortunately commit horrible atrocities, and what precipitated the Turkish invasion was an attempt by the Greek junta, the junta of generals in Greece, to annex Cyprus. They tried to overthrow the democratically elected Makarios leadership in Cyprus, and they basically tried to have like a fascist coup basically in Cyprus to annex Cyprus to Greece under the junta. And Turkey invaded in reaction to that, and then the junta fell, and the junta fell within a week, and then the Turkish military pushed on, and they were the ones in the wrong when they pushed on. The junta fell. There was no longer a threat to Turkish Cypriots, and they pushed on. It was basically a predetermined plan for ethnic cleansing, because they basically kept on going until they pushed to a line about halfway down the middle of the island, and every Greek Cypriot was expelled from their homes, and there was mass ethnic cleansing on both sides, population expulsions. So it's this horrible problem where, like, the Greek Cypriots, I still believe, like, in the grand scheme of things, the fact that Cyprus is still under military occupation, there's still no right of return for Greek Cypriot refugees, still hundreds of thousands of Greek Cypriots descend from families that were ethnically cleansed. I still think that the balance of historical wrongs is perpetrated by the Turkish nationalist side against Greek Cypriots. I still think overall the balance of historical wrongs, but I do also have to understand and accept, as a Greek Cypriot descended person, that the Greek Cypriots did have fascists who were just trying to purge Turkish Cypriots, and their dream was to kill every Turkish Cypriot. And these guys were fascists, and they wanted to kill people based on their race. And I hate that. And these were the guys who brought on destruction for Cyprus. I mean, if they hadn't had these dreams of ethnic cleansing, and they hadn't had these dreams of mass genocide and persecuting people based on their idea of creating a perfectly ethnically homogenous state, then the destruction of Cyprus with the 1974 military invasion, it wouldn't have happened in the end. And it reminds me a bit of Hamas and October 7, you know, it's horrific. And I hate what the IDF has done in Gaza since then. And I've opposed the bombing from the start because I said it's going to create a terrible humanitarian crisis, and it's born out of anger, and there's no strategy. I'm against Hamas, but there's no strategy in a collective punishment. It's just immoral and wrong. So I have opposed it from the start, but it does make me so sad, like thinking in as part of their dream of ethnic cleansing, you know, October 7, killing as many people as they could, they brought on horrible destruction. And it reminds me of how there were the Greek Cypriot fascists who brought on massive destruction to Cyprus. And I just
part of humanism is understanding that every side and every individual really is capable of great good and great also great evil, right? We all have that capacity within ourselves to do wrong and to do harm, but also to do good and to make peace. Yes. And that's really what my mission is. I'm trying to encourage people to look to make peace, because I think that's the most reasonable, stable, decent thing to do. And you know, I hope that is the, you know, in the end, that's going to be the case for all the conflicts, including you know, the conflict you're talking about in Cyprus, which is obviously a terrible tragedy.
And like with Cyprus, like there are still the Greek Cypriots who dream of Enosis and dream of Cyprus being formally part of Greece. There's still, you know, people on the Greek Cypriot right who believe in that, and they've got this vision of, you know, ethnic purity and, you know, controlling everything. But the only solution at the end of the day is living side by side in peace and acknowledging that both peoples were historically wronged and both sides carried out atrocities and both sides have suffered historical trauma, and recognizing each other as human beings, and that, you know, that process of historical truth telling and mutual recognition, that's the only solution. And look,
absolutely,
like, that's what I know in the Cypriot case, which is literally just across the waters from Israel-Palestine. And honestly, it reminds me really similar. And so when people try to say, well, Drew, you're just like a hypocrite who just believes in the Western narrative and you support it, people say, oh, well, Drew, you support Israel because you're part of like the Western camp. Well, like that's not how I see it, right? The way I see it is I've looked just in my own personal historical background, I've got these lessons from Greek Cyprus, and, you know, the fact that there was fascists on the Greek Cypriot side who believed in ethnically cleansing everything in pursuit of a perfectly homogenous society, and they brought on utter horror and destruction. And it went from, you know, my Bapu growing up in the 1930s and 40s, like literally sleeping in the open air in Turkish Cypriot villages as a Greek Cypriot. It went from that to the ethnic cleansing of like every Greek Cypriot from North Cyprus and the ethnic cleansing of Turkish Cypriots from Southern Cyprus. This was what I learned, you know, the history. And it's just, in this side, you know, the fascists on both sides destroyed it for everyone. And that's what I honestly think has to be kept in mind in the Israel-Palestine thing. You can't say that either side is perfectly good. You can't say that either side is perfectly evil either. Both people have been historically wrong. Both people have legitimate historical claims. Both people have historical trauma. That's the only thing, mutual recognition.
I think what I'll leave on is a slightly scary note, which is to say that, you know, this sort of conflict and trauma, as you mentioned, it happened in Cyprus. It's happened with Israel and Palestine. It can happen everywhere.
Yes.
If we let it, if we let hatred into our hearts, this could happen anywhere. Nowhere is immune to intercommunal violence. Yeah. And that's why we have to be so firm as humanitarians and as humanists in rejecting this.
Yes. Oh, absolutely, John. Like, I think that is the thing that we just have to hold fast to as the core thing, humanism, the belief that all human beings are valuable, all lives are valuable, all human beings have equal worth, dignity. That is the fundamental idea that we need to hold to.
Absolutely.
And if we can hold to that, then we can keep the ghost of fascism from rising again in this century. And I think that's a scary thing. We're seeing it rise again.
Let us pray that we can do that.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much for this awesome chat.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Tell listeners where they can follow you, and keep up to date with
my name's John Aziz. You can follow me on X, formerly Twitter, as Azizonomics with a 0 in it, AZIZ0NOMICS. So, thank you once again for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
John, before we go, I was going to say you should start up like a Substack and write a lot more, because you've got really good things to say, and your voice needs to be heard.
Yeah, Substack's one of the things I'm looking at. I'm looking at options to kind of help me to do this a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Thank you,
Drew.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. And
all the best.
And yeah, man, I really admire your consistent humanist approach these past few weeks, and just want to thank you for it.
Cheers. All the best. Take care.
See you, mate. Bye.